Before the video starts, just letting you know that I'm sick, so my voice might sound off. I'd have waited till I was better, but I didn't want to delay this video anymore. Thank you. In the western highlands of Hrothgar, Orsinium was recently put to ashes by the legendary King Edgar Orc Crusher. For many Bretons, this was the beginning of an era of safety, with the monsters vanquished, and for the Orcs, it was a tragedy, which would likely never be redeemed. High Rock is a place of conflict, whether that's on the battlefield or in the kingly courts of Daggerfall and Wayrest, which is reflected in the loose morals of the man cultures in the area. The history of the Bretons as magically inclined men with vague elven heritage is reflected by the continued presence of high elves from the island of Balfiera. This unique heritage is what makes a Breton, at least by birth, but now the Bretons are better known for their courtly lifestyles and codes of chivalry. You might even compare it to the rigid societal expectations of Alinor, albeit a bit looser. Either way, history is for the scholars, kings make the present and the future their domain. In the Kingdom of Wayrest, a new king is taking control through his immense talent for skullduggery. This was not uncommon for the region, and he quickly secured legitimacy in the Wayrest court, despite his humble origins. Alessio's grand ambition got him exactly what he wanted, but now he had to figure out what to do next. In theory, he ought to follow in the footsteps of the High Rock nobility and begin securing himself some marriages and alliances, but there is surely more to kingship than that. Today we'll be dropping in as Alessio Draconis of Wayrest, as we take him and his lineage to great heights in the fractured High Rock. For the time being, Alessio's ascent was commonly understood to have been facilitated by murder, but without any evidence for it, it remained a rumor that would plague his rule. The answer, in Alessio's mind, was to just do more murder. He was good at what he knew, and he knew how to strategically remove obstacles. First things first, a marriage, and this choice would be important. Wayrest is by no means a military power, and an alliance with a prominent military force will keep Wayrest safe from other scheming Bretons, pillaging Redguards, and any Orcish remnants around the kingdom. For his choice of marriage, there was no better pick than the niece of Edgar Orc Crusher, Zinedine. The Northmen of High Rock are much more martially inclined, but Alessio isn't planning to take on any Northman ways of life, as it might delegitimize him amongst the Iliac nobles. After the wedding, he dedicated himself to Akatosh, feeling an affinity with the powerful dragon god who inspired the name of his royal line. This is where Alessio's reputation as a cunning murder king would come to the forefront of his rule. Traditionally, Breton kings in Wayrest focused on placating local lords to maintain their power, and maintained small royal domains to keep the often capricious nobles happy. This will not be the way for Wayrest's new kingdom. A harrowing sign of the coming times was Alessio's first masterpiece, the Forest of Corpses outside Wayrest Castle. Officially, this was a sign to the bandits and lowlifes of the kingdom that they would not be tolerated, but many nobles across the kingdom understood this was a sign for them too. Surveying the land, it was clear that the land north of Wayrest Castle, Grimdale and Cumberland, would be better off in the hands of the king. He can't just revoke the land though, given the difficulty of circumventing Breton feudal traditions, so he'll put those ambitions aside for now. Instead, Alessio eyed up the land of Alcaire along the border with his Northman allies. He declared war to conquer Alcaire, and this would be an opportunity to show off the kingdom's military prowess. During the war, his first son, Alduin, not that one, was born. Children will be important for his plans, as he'll need to get his family's name into the mouths of the other kingdoms in order to legitimize himself as the king of Wayrest. Upon the birth of Alduin, Alessio received an interesting offer from the Altmer of Balfiera. The kin lord, Ancontar Ian Hasolmo, who was the powerful ruler of the Adamantine Tower, offered to raise Alduin in the ways of magic in return for mutual non-aggression. Not an alliance, but simply an agreement to leave each other alone would be struck. Whether Ancontar was afraid of Alessio was uncertain, but it was clear that Ancontar wanted to keep his realm safe in case the upstart Wayrest Bretons got ambitious. In Alessio's mind, a magical education was certainly a boon, and Ancontar didn't seem to be a bad elf. His intentions appeared genuine, and so Alduin was immediately sent to be raised in the Adamantine Tower by the Balfieri. With the war in Alcaire over, Alessio returned home to cheers from the people and nobles alike, who seemed to let their guard down, thinking Alessio only planned to expand his royal domain by taking from foreign nobles. They were quite wrong. Upon returning home, plans to remove the lords of Grimdale and Cumberland from power began. There was no legal way to do it, but if the family there was to find themselves unable to name an heir, the land would pass into the king's hands by default. And so the Earl of Cumberland, Jory, and his son, Irving, were the first targets of the murder king. Irving was killed first, and the next kill would be Jory's sister, Mina. Jory himself fell soon after, putting the unfortunate Mina on the throne. The Earl of Grimdale was Alessio's own spymaster, and for that reason, he'd get to her later, perhaps replacing her once her life was deemed forfeit. These murders continued for some months, until the final heir, Benjamin of Cumberland, shakily took the role of Earl. You'd think they'd stop accepting the inheritance eventually, but maybe each successive Earl thought they were special. Benjamin was killed on the 24th of Morningstar, but Alessio's role in the death was irrevocably outed, showing that the murder king was no rumor. Not that it matters, as these new territories gave Alessio power over his vassals. He would create a larger army of battle mages and Iliac pikemen to be his royal guard. Many of the nobles simply stayed loyal out of fear of reprisal, given Alessio's vengeful personality. Among the inheritance from Benjamin and House Cumberland was the Orichalc scalpel. The sword was an artifact of the war with Orsinium, and it would certainly make a fine weapon in Alessio's hand, earning him the approval of the orc-hating Northmen. During all this time, Zinedine had been producing many new heirs for Alessio, and although they'd need time to grow up before marriage, this was certainly a sign of the Divine's approval. Sometimes Alessio missed Alduin, but he knew that he was setting the kid up for greatness by harnessing his magical potential. Looking further beyond his realm, Alessio conquered the last piece of the Alcair rump state in Tuskrutz. Alduin reached 6 years of age, and already he was showing a great magical potential under the elves' tutelage. At the same time, news reached the court of the fall of the Akaviri potentate, with Atrebus coming out on top. What that will mean for Cyrodiil is up for debate, but ultimately it's not particularly relevant to High Rock. It's more like interesting news to read about while passing the time. With the conquest of Alcair complete, Alessio would focus in on securing control on his new land and completing the removal of the Orcs from Hrothgar. Although formidable, having Orcs on the border was intolerable, and so he marched north into the mountains to remove these pariah folk. Speaking of pariahs, the cult of Azura in the mountains north of Wayrest was also the target of conquest. Daedra are chaotic, and chaos isn't welcome in the kingdom or its surroundings for now. The Abbey of the Pariah would be converted into a shrine to the 8 divines. Now that Wayrest had established itself as a rising power in the region, the thought of an even further expanding kingdom was on Alessio's mind. He could use war to get what he wanted, but that would be slow, expensive, and ultimately, most likely, ineffective. Instead, he'll try to convince the Glenumbran lords in the west that he has their best interests in mind, and that he's a true ruler. This will take time, and many diplomatic talks. All the while, the Murder King was still hard at work, ensuring that no nobles of his own realm ever felt too secure. It was in Second Era 456 that Alessio finally made headway with the neighboring Lesser Kings, and a vast expansion of Wayrest began. First, the kings of Gavaudan, between Wayrest and Evermore, agreed to join the Superior Kingdom. This was only the beginning, though. In order to better assert the nobility of his realm, Alessio made the controversial yet ultimately wise move to adopt Altmaris language as the new language of Wayrest's noble court. This would certainly alienate some of the local Breton lords, but it would elevate Wayrest to something different, something more noble. It would also be a show of good faith for the Balfieri, who of course approved of the decision. By promising the King of Cambria protection for Glenumbran customs, he too accepted Wayrest's overlordship. This would begin the cascade of Glenumbran fealty. There was much discontent with the Kingdom of Daggerfall and its inability to establish itself as a powerful kingdom, so many Glenumbran lords looking to get back at Daggerfall sided with the Iliac Wayrest kingdom. Some lords, like Mariette of Camlorn, would need some convincing. In the meantime, the Northmen of Phrygius, who held on to one of the older Bredic faiths, were happy to swear fealty in return for religious protection, given their fear of Shornhelm reprisal. With a little bit of money to grease the wheels, more Northmen swore fealty, and Wayrest has now made moves into both Glenumbra and the north of High Rock. To celebrate, Alessio took his lords and their knights off to a tournament in Bancorai to compete against the martially talented Redguard. He had no real interest in any Redguard land, but Bancorai was something of a border territory which would need to be influenced at least by the Bretons. The hope was to demonstrate Breton competence to at least some extent, even if the chances of winning such a competition were almost impossible. The chosen competition was wrestling, which the Bretons didn't have much experience with. They were more acquainted with honorable duels and swordsmanship, and so the Redguards took the win. Nonetheless, the Breton presence was appreciated and fostered good relations between the Redguards and the Bretons. Upon returning home, Alessio was surprised to see his son Alduin waiting for him in the castle. Indeed, he had forgotten that his son's 16th birthday had arrived, and the Altmer did indeed send him back home with his new magical education. While Alduin hadn't learned any spells over there, which was odd, he had been trained on how to access his magical abilities and could, from there, learn all the spells he wanted with enough time and study. Immediately, Alessio arranged a marriage for Alduin with a Shornhelm princess named Mitan. Now, with the marriage secured, Alessio needed only to remove everyone else in Shornhelm's succession to ensure that his family would rule in the north. The previous queen of Camlorn passed away, not by the Murder King's hand, and her replacement, Percival, was willing to swear fealty to Wayrest, again with the obligation to protect Glenumbran culture. This led to several other minor Glenumbran lords to also swear fealty, and now Wayrest controlled a significant portion of Western High Rock. With the sudden and tragic death of the entire family of Shornhelm, the mourning princess, now queen, Mitan, took her throne, with her supportive husband Alduin using whatever magic tricks he could to raise her spirits. In time, their children will rule Shornhelm and Wayrest jointly, truly unifying the realms, even if nominally the kingdoms are separate for now. News of Skyrim's division reached Wayrest, and although still not quite relevant to High Rock interests, Skyrim was more relevant than Cyrodiil, and so the situation there would be closely watched. Another period of calm came to Wayrest, with petty noble issues coming to Alessio's focus. Little rivalries would be solved wherever possible, For example, when Duke Varric of Cambria found himself in the spotlight of Alessio's vengeful nature, he later found himself drinking a poisonous wine. He was suspected of being a vampire anyway due to his interesting night habits. Alongside the local issues, work on infiltrating the Evermore family of Amiable III began, with his wife dying in childbirth while he was still young. The 20-year-old king would need a new wife, and he seemed to be almost willing to marry matrilineally. Meanwhile, the armies of Wayrest were investigating their new lands in the north, when they came across a massive academy dedicated to the old god Magnus. The academy was run by Archmage Gyron, whose existence had only been theorized in the past. Immediately, a demand that he submit to Wayrest was sent, but was refused, and so the army invaded the academy, seizing it for themselves. This left the great sage with nowhere to go, but rather than persecute him for his wayward faith, Alessio personally asked the wizard to come to this court and serve as the great court wizard of this new, united Hierarch. Magnus, although an old god, was still revered by many Bretons, and to hear that a legendary wizard of Magnus was working the Wayrest side would only benefit Alessio's claim to the entire peninsula. The wizard did agree and joined the court. Why he did so is uncertain, as a mage as powerful as him could have just left. Maybe he felt that Alessio's destiny was to unite Hierarch. Maybe Magnus himself spoke to Gyron about the importance of the supposed Murder King's ascension. For his own safety's sake, Gyron was asked to at least outwardly worship the 8 divines, so that potentially zealous nobles of the court won't take any action to harm him. It's quite unlikely the sage actually held the divines in his heart. Back in Evermore, Amiable seemed unwilling to marry himself off to the Wayrest family, so instead his sister Margaret was married to one of Alessio's sons, and then Amiable and his family were removed from the table. The child queen Margaret, assuming she didn't lose her throne, will eventually give birth to heirs of the Wayrest family, and with that, Evermore was effectively taken as well. From here, Alessio started to believe in his own destiny as the true High King of Hierarch, but in order to claim that title, he'd have to take control of the Durrani Tower from the Balfieris. Although the elves had banked on Alessio being amenable to their wishes after they taught his firstborn the wonders of magic, they hadn't accounted for the cutthroat nature of Breton lords. Ultimately, every deal and every agreement is made with an interest in mind, and now that Alduin has been educated, the agreement of non-aggression no longer stood as far as the Bretons were concerned. Initially, sieging the Durrani Tower was difficult, but with enough time, the Altmer battle mages would be starved out. You'd think such magical elves could have just conjured up some food or something, but let's not get caught up on the details of how sieging works. Ankontar was not willing to surrender even after the tower fell, so Alessio sailed back to the mainland and confronted the High Elf army. In the battle, the Balfieri king was captured and forced to surrender the Great Tower to the Bretons. The only part of Western Hierarch left to conquer now, be that through diplomacy or war, would be Daggerfall. This was complicated because an outright invasion of the kingdom, although certainly possible, would be difficult to justify to the Glenumbran lords. Sure, a war here or there might pass, but Daggerfall, the hub of Glenumbran culture, it would have to be secured diplomatically. Putting that project on the back burner, Alessio worked towards the Orcish remnants of northeastern Hierarch. These orcs, the defeated Orsinium refugees, will certainly not go down easily, nor will they go down diplomatically. The coalition of Bretons from Wayrest, Glenumbra, Evermore, and Shornhelm easily overpowered the people of Shipwreck Cove, which would serve as the launching point from which the Hrothgar campaign would begin. At least, that was what Alessio had intended. It seemed his destiny, though, would elude him, as during the campaign, he suddenly collapsed into a coma, from which most believed he might never wake. The armies completed the conquest of Shipwreck Coast on Alessio's behalf, but the kingdom turned inward from here, focusing on how to divide up the kingdom amongst the many children. The Murder King was finally down, and many nobles breathed a sigh of relief, and the Orcs of Hrothgar began their preparations to prevent their complete conquest. Had Alessio not fallen here, it would likely have been he that united Hierarch, but it seems the Divines did not wish it, or perhaps Malakath inflicted the stroke on the Orcs' behalf. It's uncertain. Curiously, the wizard Gyron stuck around even after the destined champion's fall. Was Alessio asleep? Was he in a meditative state? Or perhaps some kind of magical trance? It was uncertain, but what was certain was that he was alive. He was breathing, and his skin maintained its color. He could, at times, open his eyes barely and even make simple gestures. No mage could identify any curse or blight in him. It seemed he simply had something wrong with his mind. Indeed, had the world of Elder Scrolls spent more time on medicinal science, they'd know he had a stroke, but it makes you wonder how a magical world would react to something like this. The unprecedented expansion of Wayrest, all mostly without any war effort, hadn't actually made much of an impact anywhere outside of Hierarch itself. To most of the surrounding region, it seemed like the Bretons were just doing what Bretons do, with oaths of fealty and wars against savage orcs. The conquest of the Durrani Tower did make some news as far as the Imperial City, given the tower's importance to the oldest building in Tamriel. Initially, Wayrest itself nearly went into an anarchic power grab over the worries of how to handle the comatose king, but luckily, Alduin returned home from Shornhelm to help keep everyone in line. He was the next in line, and his magical aptitude and support from the Northmen let him securely declare that once his father breathed his last breath, he would step in, no earlier and no later. Meanwhile, down in Daggerfall, the complacent King Bernard saw the coma as the cue that tensions would calm down. He allowed his daughter Elibeth to marry another of Alessio's sons. He would live, or rather die, regretting that decision, as even in his coma, Alessio was able to communicate with his son, Alduin, his wishes. It seems the king was still ambitious and somewhat lucid, and Alessio was able to decipher his father's request using mind-reading magic. With all of Barnand's children except Elibeth dead, the Daggerfall king knew exactly what was coming and began to comprehend the magnitude of his mistake. After escaping one assassination attempt through sheer luck, Barnand ended up dying of stress before another attempt could be made. Perhaps he was so busy worrying about the assassinations he knew were coming his way that he wasn't taking care of himself. Poor guy. With Elibeth on the throne, it would only be one more generation before Daggerfall too was ruled by the Wayrest clan. For his great work as the near unifier of High Rock, Alessio was granted the name The Bold, and despite still being alive, chronicles and songs about his greatness were already being written in a posthumous style. In Second Era 481, Alessio stopped breathing and truly passed away at the age of 66, leaving his thrones to Alduin, his firstborn son from Shornhelm. Obviously, the magically blessed Breton would have to do everything in his power to live up to the legendary status of his father, and he'll do his best. He's poised to unite the High Kingdom, but whether he can pull it off or not is yet to be seen. Shadows and darkness somewhat surround the newly coronated King Alduin's initial rule. The first shadow he had to contend with was that of his father, whose fame and reputation were an immense hurdle if Alduin were to legitimize himself. While not completely incompetent by any means, Alduin lacked the diplomatic and sneaky touch of his father, placing it with scholarship and magic. That being said, magic is no replacement for cunning. Simply put, Alduin was not as cunning as his father in any aspect really, and where he particularly suffered was as an administrator. He had only limited experience as a king by marriage during his time in Shornhelm, and his education in the Durrani Tower only taught him magic. Nonetheless, rather than shore up his weaknesses, Alduin chose to focus on developing his magical abilities for use as a king, focusing on practical magical applications. He took on Magnus as his patron, much to the pleasure of his court wizard. Taking after his father, he then started a plot to murder his niece, Alausa, in Evermore, only because he was her heir, and she was in a civil war that she would clearly lose. It would be better that the realm passed to Alduin than that she sit there suffering against the rebels. Thankfully for Alduin, it seemed like there were no factions against his rule internally, as his father had done a good job creating a realm where only the king would have a significant power. Most of the petty kings and dukes from Glenumbra simply didn't take an interest in who the king was, as long as they were allowed to keep their power, and the Northmen saw him as kin for many decades in Shornhelm. Queen Alausa of Evermore, at the young age of 4, was assassinated. The kingdom passed to Alduin, but the rebelling vassals nonetheless kept the fight going, and so his first major conflict would begin. The Evermore nobles were nothing to scoff at, but with Shornhelm's help, Alduin should be able to defeat them. This war was important because it was an opportunity to prove himself in the field, and because if he could win the day, the ransoms he could demand from the imprisoned Evermore families would help fund campaigns against the Orcs and Reachmen of Eastern High Rock. Initially, the coalition of nobles massed up and began sieging Cumberland with a massive army. Alduin would need his wife's support to possibly win this, but she was far away. Looking to help, the court wizard, Gyron, offered to summon a friend from Oblivion to help out. This friend would be a Dremora named Ranyu Vola, and although the wizard was more than capable enough to control the Dremora, and Alduin was aware that it was quite common to summon Dremora temporarily to aid with particular tasks, the less magically inclined and uneducated people of Wayrest grew extremely weary at the thought of Dremora entering Tamriel. This Dremora was one of Boethia's agents, and his combat prowess was certainly a great boon for the army, but it wouldn't prove enough to possibly defeat the Evermore coalition, given that most of the Wayrest army was actively hoping the Dremora would be slain. Rather than throw men away, Alduin allowed Cumberland to fall, and then took on a battle against some out-of-position armies. Unfortunately, those out-of-position lords would be swiftly reinforced, resulting in many losses, and an infected wound on the Dremora. Hoping to bring in some reinforcements and then try again, Alduin rushed back to Pariah Hill but was defeated once again. As a means to prove his worth, this war so far was going terribly, as a significantly smaller region of Evermore was somehow holding its own against the vast Wayrest kingdom. After some time reinforcing, Alduin took on another battle, this time with his wife's army to support him right on the Iliac Bay coast. The battle was costly, but it was the first victory of the war. Pressing their advantage, Alduin took the army to Cumberland, hoping to reclaim the orichalcum mines in the area. Once the Cumberland garrison surrendered, he marched back to the Iliac Bay to fight his enemies once again, followed by his wife. Although his enemies managed to occupy Gewis, he swiftly defeated them and took back the city. Despite these victories, dissatisfaction among Wayrest nobility started to crop up, with some lords citing Alduin's failures in this war as reason to put his much more competent sister, Brienne, on the throne. Rather than be afraid of these rising factions, Alduin focused on the war in Evermore and turned the tides back in his favor. This stress was really starting to pile up, and Alduin took to a habit of alcoholism to cope with it. This was seen as quite uncouth by the noble Iliac and Glenumbran lords, but they would overlook it for now. With a few more victories, the war in Evermore was ended in Second Era 487, ending a 6-year-long war. Finally, Alduin could relax. It was quite unfortunate though that he spent so much of his rule at war with his own nobles. Meanwhile, his father had been acquiring new lords and dispatching orcs at his age. If there was any recompense for the war though, it would be the ransoms from the Evermore lords for the safe return of their lords. While restoring his reputation and reaching new heights were on his mind, Alduin also needed time to relax, so he did what he loves. He went to study at the university north of Hrothgar. He had often attended it when he was with his wife in Shornhelm, and the opportunity to visit once again would please him greatly. Nonetheless, it seemed the visit didn't help him relax enough, as he got caught up in a bunch of socializing, which he detested. The stress culminated in 489 when Alduin resigned himself to never reaching the illustrious fame of his father, which put yet more stress on him. Even as he made progress into the Reach, fighting the savages there and claiming it for Wayrest, he knew that these conquests were nothing compared to his father's. His next target was in Cloud Spring, where the vampire lord Harkon had set up his new home after being removed from Volkihar by some dark elves. Despite the vampire lord being very intimidating, one powerful vampire can't defeat thousands of men in war, so he was crushed. But Lord Harkon wasn't looking to find a new home to settle in. Instead, he joined the Wayrest court, much to the dismay of the lords there. The dark shadows following Alduin seemed darker than ever, as he now had a Dremora and a family of Molag Bal worshipping vampires accompanying him. Some even suspected he was a vampire himself. Both Serana and Harkon himself would prove to be great knights for the kingdom, knights who would serve seemingly with no particular demands. As part of their joining the court, and as a show of good faith, Alduin made the vampires renounce Molag Bal and worship the divines, which is pretty much undeniably just a show, as true vampires of some millennia's age don't just give up on their master Molag Bal, but it was at least enough to not have the Breton lords slaughter them on sight. Further wars against the Reachmen of Eastern High Rock broke out, with most of them going smoothly. The only war around which there was any trepidation was against the Orcs of Faerun, who had unified in anticipation of a Breton campaign back when Alessio was king. Initially, the war was going quite poorly, but Alduin got the upper hand for a brief period. That was until the Orcs unified their armies and slaughtered the Breton soldiers, leading to a white peace, as the Bretons agreed to leave their occupations behind and the Orcs allowed Breton prisoners and wounded to go free. King Sharkub of Faerun was interesting for an Orc. He wasn't particularly militarily talented, and yet he had gotten to be the head of the Orcs of High Rock. This may have been on account of his scheming personality and suspected vampirism. One thing which was somewhat overlooked was Skyrim's involvement in High Rock by this point. The High King of Western Skyrim had probably unintentionally taken some small sections of High Rock through inheritances, which, although annoying, were inconsequential, after the land gained independence due to its distance from the Empire. Once those realms were independent, they would swiftly swear fealty to Wayrest, although they did this with promise of cultural and religious protection, meaning there was now a growing minority of Nords intermingling with the Northmen in regions where Skyrim's nobles were marrying. With everything happening to the Shadow King Alduin, he had a sudden desire to travel. He knew that ultimately he would have to build up a lot more to take on the Orcs, and that he had already completed the acquisition of Daggerfall and Shornhelm, at least for the future, since his family would rule those thrones in just a few generations. He arranged for a great pilgrimage to the Imperial City, hoping to get some guidance from the Divines on how to handle the crushing weight of his father's legacy. The trip was not a direct route, as Alduin was hoping to visit many different parts of Cyrodiil, Hammerfell, and Nibelheim, in the hopes of finding inspiration from any of those locations. He began his trip passing through Hammerfell's deserts first, where he then took a ship to Abba's Landing. The pirates of the region certainly left him feeling uneasy, but the trip ended up moving safely as the ships he took had the appearance of simple pilgrim vessels. He ended up in Anvil before heading east towards Cyrodiil. He stopped by Gavach, having images in his mind of Oblivion Gates, Mehrunes Dagon, and horse armor, but he put the thoughts down. Who would put armor on a horse, after all? He passed through Skingrad, amazed by the beautiful plains and forests of Cyrodiil, before reaching the Abbey of the Eight. Unfortunately though, Alduin had gotten ill, presumably from all the traveling at such an old age, and died from the chills. While his death was sad, it wasn't mourned the same way as his father's death, which would certainly have upset him if he were alive to know it. Alduin died at age 57, leaving the throne to his daughter Giselle. She was a much more capable leader than her father, and she was in a betrothal to the King of the Reach, which would bring High Rock into conflict with Skyrim. She's also the daughter of the Queen of Shornhelm, which meant she would be the one to unify the two kingdoms. Giselle's reign initially was quite popular, as she was better spoken, more talented, and free of the capricious influence of vampires and Dremora. While Lord Harkon still lived in Wayrest, his influence with Giselle was minimal compared to with Alduin. Nonetheless, many people believed that Alduin's impact on the court would remain for some while. In many ways, the vampires which had been invited in would probably never leave unless they were chased out. Giselle didn't feel the need to remove them, and some people attributed that to the power of vampiric seduction, but Giselle held that Harkon was a willing and able knight, and that so long as he remained that way, he'd always have a place in the court. For this reason, Giselle was called the Innocent. She saw no evil, and saw only good in herself alongside a healthy dose of noble righteousness. In a lot of ways, her stubborn arrogance was actually completely exemplary of a Breton noble, which made her extremely popular. Giselle's goal now is to finish the fight with the Orcs and unite High Rock into one high kingdom, as she saw it as her destiny. Where her father failed, and where her grandfather was tragically denied his destiny, Giselle would claim it. Initially, Giselle had to prove her worth, as some of the anti-Harkon groups of the kingdom simply wouldn't abide any monarch that kept the vampires around. Princess Brienne, who the lords had previously supported against Alduin during the Evermore War, was once again propped up. Obviously, Giselle wouldn't give up her throne, and she called in her mother while rushing to take Auxerre, the capital of the rebels. The capital fell quickly, and the rebels scattered, presuming that Giselle wouldn't be nearly this competent. She was a well-respected orator, but in reality she was a commander too, and with Harkon on the field, many soldiers feared not only for their lives, but their immortal souls. With another occupation outside Auxerre, the rebels surrendered, and much like Alduin, Giselle used these rebels to fill her coffers. With the tension at home taken care of, Giselle embarked on a similar pilgrimage that her father took, where she would go to the Imperial City, stopping by the area of Skingrad where it was reported that her father passed away. No one at court had even brought it up, but Giselle felt the need to recover her father's body out of respect for him, and this was a wildly popular move. The nobles were coming to respect Giselle's dedication to the high-minded High Rock ideals, and her focus on the elevation of Wayrest beyond a simple kingdom kept the more hawkish lords in check. Giselle's trip won't be a simple trip to this imperial city, but rather something of a pilgrimage across much of western Tamriel. She'd be taking the same route as her father, with some additional stops early on at certain academies in High Rock. She traveled through Old Orsinium, seeing the historical locations of many atrocities committed against the Orcs. Though the Orcs were once natural enemies of High Rock, the abject slaughter did feel a bit outside of Breton ideals. She encountered a poor beggar in western Shornhelm where she gave as much charity as she could, with the image of the ruins of Orsinium putting her in a giving mood. Giselle from that day started to understand the peasants and lowlifes of her realm better, shifting away from her arrogance and more towards a generous nature. Alongside that, her sympathy towards the Orcs was starting to be interpreted as outright Malakath worship. Whether she truly did worship the Prince of the Scorned or not, this was good news for the Orcs of Faerun, who also had received some news of the sympathy this new queen had for their plight. She'd even been studying the Orcish language, which she argued was purely a scholarly pursuit. She did fail to learn the language, and for that reason, suspicions of her Orcish sympathy started to wane. As far as her outward position, Giselle still very much advocated for the conquest of Faerun. Whether that entailed the elimination of the Orcs there or not was still in question. The kingdoms and realms she visited gave her a vastly expanded toolset, and she learned a ton about governance outside of her preconceived notions. She understood better the administrative talents of the Cyrodiilic bureaucrats, and she learned about shows of strength and martial prowess from the Redguards. From the dedicated priests of Kavach, she learned about the nature of the divines and how to best interpret signs from them. She even asked the Kavach priests about the nature of Daedric princes, where they explained the nuance of many Daedric lords, but the ultimately destructive nature of all of them. After passing through Skingrad, she reached the Abbey of the Eight Divines, and within the abbey, the monks mentioned that they had prepared her father's body, expecting someone would come for it eventually. They were able to determine he was a Breton from his clothing, and expected that it might take some time. The body was transferred to Giselle's pilgrimage company, and the entourage continued on. Seeing the corpse of a royal is always an interesting experience. The already humbling experience with those poor beggars in High Rock had put Giselle into a thoughtful mood, and her affinity for Malakath and the Orcs seemed to be growing, but from here she kept it a secret, choosing not to share her thoughts with the entourage. Having visited many of the kingdoms in the region, Giselle got an idea of what the political landscape of the former potentate looked like. It turns out the Nords of Bruma mostly filled the power vacuum, with minor kings across Nibelheim and Cyrodiil carving out kingdoms where they could. The kingdom of Bruma had actually extended its power deep into Nibelheim, and firmly controlled the Imperial Isles. Before now, the Bretons hadn't even considered the politics of Cyrodiil due to their complete irrelevance to their interests, but with how powerful the soon-to-be High Kingdom of High Rock will become, it may begin taking an interest in politics here. In 507, Giselle arrived in the Imperial City, where she enjoyed the sights and people of the cosmopolitan city. The Nordic influence was clear, given that Bruma had ruled the city for some years now. Meanwhile, she received word that her mother passed away, as a messenger had been waiting in the Imperial City to deliver the news. Finally, the Northmen and Iliac Bretons are united, and many of the artifacts from Shornhelm were handed to the queen at that moment. On the way back, Giselle discovered she was pregnant, which was strange since she'd been on the road for years while her husband was in Markarth, but rest assured, King Lodvar took the trip out to the Imperial City to impregnate Giselle, and she did not cheat on her husband. She gave birth just outside of Wayrest to a daughter named Annalise. Returning to Wayrest, Giselle was welcomed and looked forward to implementing many of the new ideas she picked up from her travels. Her change in attitude only further reinforced her reputation as an innocent queen, with her generosity and kindness towards subjects only blossoming further. Yet her wanderlust was not satisfied. Giselle, rather than enjoying sitting at home more, chose to go back to the Imperial City, albeit with a more direct route, to attend the Arcanorum there. She was becoming deeply interested in Academy, particularly around the nature of the Aedra and Daedra. The trip through Hammerfell into Cyrodiil was much faster with this direct path, and she had a great time studying there, even becoming pregnant once more. Again, Lodvar simply accompanied her. There was no cheating. Giselle brought home with her one of the other students, Farandor, a wood elf who she felt was quite intelligent. Her wanderlust calmed for the time being, she took a short trip to a holy site in Glenumbra before receiving word that the Orcs of Faerûn declared war on her. This was surprising considering that there had been peace for quite a while, but the Orcs clearly were building up their power, waiting for the right moment. Perhaps they interpreted Giselle's kindness towards Orcs as weakness and seized upon it. They were looking to take the northern coast of Faerûn, perhaps for access into Skyrim. Calling upon her husband in the Reach, Giselle readied the armies, but allowed her husband to lead the war effort. She was too busy traveling to worry about it, which some Wayrest nobles did not approve of. By the time Giselle got home, she heard of the immense losses on both sides in the war, as fighting erupted in the northern coasts of Faerûn, and rather than fight, Giselle chose to surrender. This was land she didn't particularly care for, but it was a strange choice given her ambitions to become the High Queen. She reasoned that she'd rather not fight the Orcs now, but indeed show return with a vengeance in the future. Just give it time, she promised the court. By this point, there are only 3 powers left in High Rock: the doomed Kingdom of Daggerfall, the rising Kingdom of Faerûn, and the absolutely hegemonic Kingdom of Wayrest. Meanwhile, the small portions of the very furthest north and east of the High Kingdom were under Skyrim or the Reach, at least one of which was already in line to be inherited by the Bretons. With the clear supremacy of the Bretons, the influence of the Battlefield area was clearly diminishing, and for that reason Wayrest returned to speaking Bretic as its court language. This would firmly remove the importance of the Altmer from Breton identity, as well as the Auriel pantheon, given that most of the Bretons were firmly worshipping either Magnus or the 8 Divines. As well, the adaptive nature of the Iliac Bretons, with their cultural tolerance and diplomatic approach, led to their people adopting a new tradition, being malleable invaders. In general, the Iliacs are no longer as chauvinistic, choosing to adapt and respect the local administrations of their conquests and subjects, which was reflected by the strong presence of Northmen, Glenumbrans, and even to some extent Reach folk throughout the region. Perhaps such mercy might even be extended towards the spurned Orcs of Hrothgar, Giselle was hoping. Speaking of Orcs, Giselle was looking towards their battle plans to deal with Sharkub of Faerûn. It seemed pretty obvious that he was someone special, as he'd allied himself with the other Orc kingdoms in Skyrim, and amassed a significant army alongside money to pay them. Despite being much smaller, it's clear that Wayrest is matched by Faerûn and its allies. One section of land which, up to now, had evaded Wayrest, only out of the fact that it was so irrelevant that no one cared to conquer it, was the islands of Camlorn, Tethys, and Caesili. Tethys accepted an offer of vassalization, and although Caesili would have as well, war was declared due to an accidental typo on the fealty demand. Not that it really matters, this war shouldn't be anything of note. Feeling confident, Giselle raised just her men-at-arms, who upon arriving on the island, were completely slaughtered, since the island had hired mercenaries to protect itself. Hoping to reinforce before the army could be completely destroyed, Giselle sent in the levies, but they arrived after the battle had ended, promptly getting themselves destroyed as well. They had nowhere to retreat to, and suddenly, Wayrest found itself on the losing end of a war, sending war operations over to the island in shame. This was honestly a complete shock to everyone, and Wayrest found itself in debt for a while. With some time, and some help from the court wizard, the treasury would be recouped, but the military prowess of Wayrest was certainly in question now. After fixing the economy, Giselle once again finally returned to her plans for the Faerûn Orc kingdom. It was clear that the alliance of Orcish kingdoms had to be disrupted, and for that reason, plots to murder the other kings who were vulnerable due to the unstable nature of Orcish realms began. First was Grushbub of Falkranth, who controlled a large Orcish realm in southern Skyrim. Although progress was slow, and so failed attempts had to go through first, Grushbub was killed in 527, isolating Faerûn from at least one of their allies. Next was Bugak of Khazor, who went down much more easily. Plots and murders have always been the way of Wayrest Bretons, and once again we can see that in action. Immediately after, before any new alliances could be forged, war was declared. A holy war for all of Faerûn. This was a war for the very existence of the Orcish state, and for that reason it was imperative that Giselle win. Initially, the armies ignored each other, choosing to siege various parts of each other's land. King Bugdol was busy fighting in Skyrim to support his previous ally in Khazor, but he did eventually turn around to liberate his capital. The Orcs had no supplies, and Giselle pounced, taking a battle in Royan. The disorganized, hungry, and demoralized Orcs were slaughtered with no survivors. A second army, which was trying to reinforce, was next on the chopping block. This army was better supplied and didn't get completely decimated, but they also lost, putting the war clearly in Giselle's favor. Bugdul had actually been captured by the High King of Western Skyrim, and using that opportunity, Giselle arranged for his assassination in that cell, which succeeded. The strong leader of the Orcs was gone, leaving the throne to Largak, who was half the Orc Bugdul was. After a few more battles and sieges, the war ended with a Breton victory, and the Orcish kingdom was no more. The Bretons expected that the Orcs would be removed from the region, both in terms of leadership and population, but instead, Giselle placed a local Orc in power and granted him all the land in the region. This would be the first time the Orcs were ever granted land in earnest, and although Othulg, the chosen Orc to rule the land, was a pretty subpar Orc by most Orc standards, this meant they'd be allowed to exist. Although Faerûn still did exist as two separated provinces, it will quickly fade and be absorbed into Wayrest. Giselle needs just a little bit more land in order to declare herself the High Queen, but there's nowhere left to take besides Daggerfall. The queen there, Elibeth, whose heir was one of the Draconis family, was quite old, and her death would surely be coming soon. Perhaps it was early yet to do so, but Giselle celebrated her unification of High Rock with a tournament in Wayrest. It would be a tournament of singing and gaming, where she also planned to give a speech to the people with regards to her decisions around the Orcs. Demonstrating great skill, Giselle won both competitions, and during the ceremony stood before her subjects, ready to explain her plan for the Orcs. Many of you know that we have defeated the Orcs of High Rock, once again relegating them to the role of nomads, outcasts, and monsters. They've lost their chance at any semblance of civilization, and we can celebrate ourselves as the key figures in making that happen. I wonder though, will this stop the Orcs? It will take many years to drive them from their homes, and when they do leave, might they go to Skyrim? Would they go to Hammerfell? Shall they become our neighbors once again after we push them beyond our borders, only to raid us again? There is no need to tolerate the Orc menace, for they are the eternal enemies of all that would call themselves civilized. They are pariahs despite their sapience, and to Malakath do they owe that fate. I believe there is only one way out for the Orcs, and that is to abandon their patron, but how can any outsider possibly convince them of that? It is certainly impossible. At that moment, the court wizard, Gyron, who by this point had become a permanent staple of Wayrest, walked onto the ceremonial platform with some magical energy in his hands. I propose that Malakath, their dear patron, be replaced by a different god. Magnus, although not a divine, is the powerful creator of Nirn, and as Bretons we owe to him a great reverence. The only way to free the Orcs of Malakath is to make their new patron themselves. They must learn the wonders of magical power and of Magnus' gifts. If the Orcs can be settled down, given magic, and taught the ways of proper, respectable living, they can shed their history as destroyers, and become an integral part of Breton culture. What debt will all the civilized people of Tamriel feel towards us for permanently eradicating the enemies of civilization? We can be the ones that saved the Orcs, and for that, our names will live on in history forever, among both men and mer. Claim that glory, and join me in creating history. Cheers erupted from the crowd, although it was obvious not everyone was convinced. To some people, the thoughts of equipping the Orcs with magical power might only make them an even greater menace. The question was whether or not the Orcs were how they were due to Malakath's influence, or an inherent trait of Orcish blood. Could a Daedra as powerful as Malakath be opposed in such a way without any repercussions? What signs did Giselle even have that Magnus would support them in this effort? Was it just the word of the decrepit wizard? It's not like any of the nobles could oppose her, even if they wanted to. Most of the lords were loyal enough to Giselle, and the ones who weren't couldn't touch her. Not to mention, Giselle had made enough strides as queen to justify trust, and so she began working with the court wizard on a spell that would forever change the Orcs. The spell will take many years to prepare since just such a massive undertaking, and for that reason Giselle let the issue sit for a while as she looked back towards becoming High Queen. The Queen of Daggerfall finally passed away, leaving the throne to Reynad, who was Giselle's cousin. The kingdom was split between Daggerfall and Balfiera, although to call Balfiera a kingdom was dubious given it ruled nothing in the traditional Balfiera homeland. This little kingdom held no legitimacy, and for that reason Giselle invaded it right away, calling upon her family ties with Daggerfall to call them in as an ally. With the brief conquest of Balfiera, the control of Daggerfall being assured, and the Orcs conquered, Giselle was able to proclaim herself the High Queen of High Rock. The ceremony was lavish and beautiful, with Giselle's name being immortalized as the first High Queen of a united High Rock. A High Rock which was not achieved through needless bloodshed. A High Rock that saw Bretons embracing each other as friends and allies, and in the uncertain world of a post-Akaviri Tamriel, the comfort of a strong power gave many Bretons an immense sigh of relief. Any lords that were against the uplifting of the Orcs were certainly in support now after seeing their people's status elevated so high. Daggerfall soon joined the High Kingdom, and the Reach's king would be assassinated to ensure a Breton lord would sit on the throne. There was one last war to declare so that High Rock might be whole, a war against Western Skyrim. The Nords had taken a small portion of territory in the northeast, and although the Bretons weren't looking to conquer Skyrim, they certainly wanted to control all of their de jure land. The war was going well, with Harkon leading the charge, and one night, during a break in the battles, Giselle was getting some rest. When she awoke, the great vampire lord Harkon stood at the other end of the room. He offered her something which no one else could give her. Well, I say offered, but Harkon was not exactly interested in Giselle's answer. He only gave her the luxury of asking as an understanding of his respect for her power. Giselle immediately rejected the offer and grew worried at the vampire's gaze, but before she could even react, Harkon's superhuman speed let him bite her on the neck and turn her into a vampire. This was something that Harkon encouraged Giselle to keep a secret until the time was right, as she slipped into unconsciousness, transforming into a vampire lord. She took Lord Harkon on as her husband after these events, which was a pretty strong indication to most of the court something was up. The immense glory of High Rock's unification somewhat overshadowed this issue, with most people simply denying that Giselle would become a vampire, and instead seeing Harkon as a spousal advisor. After all, Giselle is too old to have children, so it's not like there's some kind of actual marital obligations going on here, right? Either way, the war in Skyrim ended, and afterwards Giselle's army would support her daughter in the Reach against some rebellious Nords that were not happy to be ruled by Bretons. Afterwards, Giselle's plan to elevate the Orcs was beginning to come to fruition as she began the mass settlement of Hrothgar with Bretons, who would become a culture of their own. The purpose of this was to begin acclimating Orcs with living alongside Bretons, and the Orcs at first were not happy, but Giselle made it clear to the Hrothgarians that they needed to treat the Orcs as equals, no matter how hard it was, and that anyone who failed in that task would be punished. The two cultures would bond over their mutual respect for war and talented fighters, which did help relations improve. The rumors about Giselle's vampirism would ultimately be confirmed by her sudden pregnancy from her husband, Harkon. Only a vampire could get pregnant in her 60s, but Giselle simply denied the accusations, saying that the child could potentially be the spawn of a divine, or a Daedra even. No one believed her, but no one was brave enough to do anything about it. The vampiric child was born in 543, Avaburl, and he certainly did resemble Harkon, which only further confirmed things. For this reason, Avaburl was mostly kept away from public view, with Giselle not wanting the vampiric accusations to get too strong. The controversy was overshadowed when Gyron entered the royal chamber with news that his spell was ready. A great ceremony around a ritual circle was drawn in Old Orsinium, with Gyron at the center, channeling immense magical energy. In one moment, Orcs across High Rock and Bretons throughout the Iliac Bay began to feel changes. This wasn't a spell that was only affecting the Orcs, but rather a spell affecting many Bretons alongside the Orcs. The spell didn't cause any harm, as no one made any noises of pain, but indeed they were looking at their arms and watching the magic enrapture them. Some Bretons reported visions of Magnus above them, blessing them with magic, and before long, the spell ended. It seemed not much had changed, really, but somehow the Orcs became significantly more docile. Not in a zombie-like sense, but their unceasing bloodlust had been, seemingly, quenched. Bretons and Orcs across Wayrest felt new kinship and everything was happy. That was, until the weather changed for the worse, and from the skies an image of Malakath appeared, and he was satisfied. I had heard inklings of your attempts to drive my people away from me, little queen. You probably think you've accomplished something with your attempt to fix the Orsimer. And indeed you have accomplished something. It's just not quite the something you think. I am the Daedric Prince of the Spurned. I am the Daedric Prince of those who have nowhere else to go. You, little queen, have allowed me to finally deliver to the Orcs exactly what they've always wanted. You think you've changed them? No, you've only worked to become just like them. You are isolated from everyone around you. You are a vampire, whether you want to pretend about it or not. You are the enemy of the Redguards, the Nords, the Imperials, the Reachmen. Need I name any more? Do you believe yourself above the conflict and war which defines the people you claim to be uplifting? You can never cure an Orc of their nature, and you can never escape the shackles of a curse. Enjoy your new life, as long as it may end up being. Take pleasure in being my slave, and knowing that you've relegated this land to be my playground. With that, the Daedric Prince compelled the people of High Rock to follow his code, and Giselle became the paragon of this Malakath-worshipping High Kingdom. High Rock was erased from history, being replaced by Orsinium. In a way, Giselle had accomplished her goal, as the Magnus-touched Orcs of Orsinium, whose name was a misnomer at this point, were still able to cast off their pariah status. For this, Giselle was called the Redeemer of the Orcs, although it was at a great cost to the people of High Rock. A short period later, the official dissolution of High Rock and its replacement by Greater Orsinium was ratified, with Giselle feeling mixed on the issue. She had not intended to so radically change her homeland to this new place, but her hand was forced by a Daedric prince. Regardless of the identity of her realm, it was clear that this Breton Orsinium would be the greatest power in Tamriel for the time being. Malakath was not providing any more instructions after Orsinium was established, and now Giselle had her entire immortal existence to consider the ramifications of her actions. The innocent queen was finally wising up, realizing that she had played with powers far beyond a mortal's purview. Harkon still held significant influence over her, encouraging her to work towards a vampire-tolerant realm, but all in good time. For now, it would be unthinkable to allow vampires free reign in Greater Orsinium, with Giselle's vampiric nature a certainty to the lords of Greater Orsinium. There was a clash of feelings. The savior of the Orcs and great paragon of Malakath was an unholy abomination. Which one will she be remembered for? For now, the innocent queen spent her time studying and distracting herself from the great question she'll have to consider for eternity. She took the Reach after her own daughter refused to engage in a duel to the death for the kingdom, showing her cowardice. With Greater Orsinium's reputation as Malakath worshipping vampires, this certainly led Skyrim to feel wary, but they could do nothing. Looking for answers, Giselle sent out Harkon to explore the world and find anything he could that might help her figure out the path she's destined for. Within a relatively short time, Harkon returned bearing Hermaeus Mora's Black Book, the Sallow Regent. Immediately, Giselle cracked open the book, despite knowing that Hermaeus Mora's influence could drive her insane. With the knowledge of the Black Book invading her mind, Giselle was strong-willed enough to avoid losing her sanity. Inside the tome, she did not find recorded history, but instead an unwritten future, where she sat in the white gold tower of Cyrodiil's imperial city. All would bow to her, and at this point, she was no longer the innocent queen. Giselle had descended into the darkness that her father brought to the kingdom. Although he was too weak to make use of it, Giselle would be the one to accept immortality and the patronage of a Daedric prince. At this point, she came out of her isolation and began her warpath to control all of Tamriel. However, this is where we shall end the Wayrest story, at least for now. Their humble origins as a rising kingdom in the Iliac Bay have led them down a path of diplomacy and war, ultimately culminating in the creation of a new realm born of mutual Breton and Orcish interest. With this, a new chapter in Tamriel's history has been written, and if the Magnus-touched Orcs can make a move to unify the continent, they may even herald the beginning of a new era. That'll be the story for another video. Thank you for your time.